Thank you, robotic voice, for saying that. Welcome everyone. My name is Sarah Bross, and today we'll be talking about making STEM more accessible to those with disabilities. For the viewers with low vision, I'll describe myself. I am a white non-binary individual. My pronouns are they, she, and I am currently sitting with a dark background. You can't really see much, but my walls are white and my ceiling is metal. So we'll get started right now. So can everyone see my screen? Perfect. So the past couple of weeks, we've been focusing on more general things related to disabilities and disability accessibility. We've been working on the introduction to the basics, and then we moved into talking about what it looks like to be an undergraduate with a disability, specifically in STEM. And this week, we'll be talking about making STEM more accessible to those with disabilities. Today's webinar will be in 3 parts. The first part includes approaches to accessibility. The second part is accessibility in the STEM classroom. And the third part, it covers accessibility in the lab. Today's webinar is going to be a bit of a roundtable discussion, so I will stop sharing my screen at some points where hopefully you guys can jump in and we can have a fruitful discussion about some of the topics that I bring up. So first, we'll be going over the approaches to accessibility. So there are 2 main approaches to accessibility. As you can see on the left, there is a picture of 3 figures. They're standing behind a fence watching a soccer game. And unfortunately, this situation is not accessible to everyone who is there, not necessarily in terms of disability in this case, but in terms of height, where there is one tall individual on the left that can see quite clearly over the fence, one medium-sized individual who can see just barely over the fence, and a smaller individual who cannot see over the fence. This is the case where things are not always accessible. In the middle situation, you have what are termed accommodations, and that's one approach to accessibility, where you have some folks that are given accommodations so that they can see over the fence to see the soccer game. The medium individual is given one big block to stand on so that they can see over the fence, and then the smaller individual is given 2 blocks. And the tall individual is not given blocks at all because he does not need accommodations. So accommodations are given to specific individuals when they are having trouble accessing a specific event. On the right side, there's something labeled universal design. And in this case, the fence is see-through, so you do not have to provide blocks in the first place. So the concept of universal design is where the activity is completely accessible to all without having to provide accommodations. In a more academic sense, what does this look like? So as a definition, accommodations are specific alterations made for disabled students to make participation in an activity more accessible. For example, in the more academic sense, it's extended time on an exam. So if you have a student who might have a cognitive or psychological disability or some other disability where they cannot focus for long periods of time, they get easily distracted, or there's a range of other reasons why you might want to give a student extended time, but you give a specific student who may need those accommodations extended time on an exam. The rest of the students who do not need accommodations will not be given extra time. This is in comparison to universal design, which is defined by alterations to the entire structure of an activity that are made, keeping all students' accessibility needs in mind. For example, design an exam to be open note and days long for every single student, regardless of whether or not they are disabled. So kind of as a talking point here, I wanted to ask you guys, what are some of the pros and cons of each approach to accessibility? Because ultimately, there isn't necessarily a right answer. Both of these approaches have pros and cons, and I wanted to discuss that for a bit. So I'll stop sharing my screen and does anyone have any ideas as to any potential pros or cons for each of these types of accessibilities?
I guess one of the cons for universal design is if there's already a system in place, like for exams, the number of changes that need to end up being made are usually reworking the entire thing. And so sometimes that provides a barrier to universal design, whereas when there's already a system in place, sometimes new accommodations can be an easier fix to the issue.
One pro of universal design is sort of by definition, it's built to accommodate people without addressing anyone's specific needs. So if someone does not feel comfortable sharing their disability or their like specific needs with the professor for one reason or another, there's sort of already a system in place to hopefully make things a little more equitable.
For sure. Some things, yeah, go ahead, EB.
Another potential pro might be of the universal design might be that not know their needs specifically. It might be something new to them, and this might help them. A con might be that it's not enough, that the universal needs might not provide specific enough help or accommodation, where individual accommodations might be able to zero in more articulately.
Exactly. I think you guys came up with all of my thoughts, which are that individually, I don't think that either of these strategies can fully accommodate everyone. Universal design is supposed to be universal, but disabilities themselves are not universal. They're very diverse. So when you're trying to universally design something, that can be difficult. At the same time, universal design or attempting universal design can be incredibly helpful for those with disabilities, because think about the effort that has to go into asking for accommodations and knowing what accommodations will help you. So ultimately, both of these can be used in combination to create the most accessible environment possible. So I'll go back to sharing my screen. So that was kind of the first part. Since we'll be talking a ton about accessibility, I just kind of wanted to give an overview of those two approaches. Now we'll be jumping into actually tackling what accessibility looks like in the STEM classroom. So I wanted to start with a question. Are there any examples of inaccessibility in the STEM classroom that you can think of currently?
Definitely things like lack of chairs and like things that are like simple as that. Lack of really like the environment in the STEM classroom is really, oh, you have to like stand up and do absolutely everything all at once and stay for crazy amounts of time, and that's not who get worn out really easily and like need to be conserving their energy for the better of the health. And I think that's one of the biggest issues in the STEM kind of environment in general.
Yeah, definitely. I've definitely experienced that in specifically my chem labs, not having chairs for everyone, and then everyone kind of competes to get the spots with chairs, which is not necessarily the most disability friendly environment. Any other ideas?
I remember last week when we were talking about undergraduate experiences, some of the panelists were talking about when they're sitting in a chair that the lab bench, or if they have a day when they need a wheelchair, the lab bench is not always set at a height that they can successfully do the experiment in a safe manner. So all of the lab benches I've ever really been at, specifically for chem labs, I think bio labs you can sit in a chair and reach, but if I were seated, I would have a hard time reaching everything I needed to reach.
Let's get maybe one more idea before I give you guys the answers.
Maybe like kind of off what I was like saying, how like you're expected to stay around for such a long time is like they don't really give you enough time. Sometimes they're like, especially like student based labs, so like even like a time accommodation would be, you know, something that'd be better.
Yeah, definitely. And I want to acknowledge that this is a difficult question to answer if you don't identify as having a disability, because before I had identified as disabled and had started experiencing disability as my, as my everyday experience, it was definitely something that I had never thought about. And kind of once that changed for me, everything in my life kind of shifted, and I realized that for myself, there's been a lot of different challenges involving accessibility, but it also gave me a frame of mind that made me realize that other folks with other disabilities may also be experiencing accessibility challenges. So it's a difficult question, but I thank you guys for giving those answers, which were all very good answers. So I'll go to my next slide, which these are some very common examples of inaccessibility in the classroom. So as we had mentioned, long classes or teaching labs. I think at the University of Rochester, our teaching labs are about 3 hours, which seems like a lot of time, and at the same time isn't enough time sometimes. I know that in my organic chemistry labs, we were definitely pressured to get a lot done in a little bit of time, which was stressful in and of itself. And at the same time, it was 3 hours, which was a lot for me to be on my feet. And I can imagine it was a lot for others. So the times of teaching labs and time restrictions, as well as the length themselves, can be very inaccessible for completely different reasons. Number 2, we had already mentioned lack of chairs in teaching labs. That's just a very common inaccessibility. Lack of virtual options. This applies more to a lecture-based format, and it can be difficult for some folks with disabilities to have a reliable schedule and always show up the same every single day. Disability is unpredictable, and therefore schedules can be unpredictable. And some days it's not always possible for someone who's disabled to make it to class. So having a virtual option is always a great way to make something more accessible. And finally, not allowing makeup dates or options. Just as the reason I gave for the last one, disability is not always predictable. So having makeup dates and allowing people to make up assignments is crucial to being accessible. I also wanted to mention that some of these things, in fact, all of them, could apply to folks who are not disabled. It can be a lot to stand for 3 hours at a time for some folks who might not be disabled. It can also be due to external circumstances like a family member passing away or getting COVID. Sometimes you need a makeup option, and not having those built in can make that an extremely stressful experience for those who aren't disabled. So some common ways to make classes more accessible include always offering virtual options. I kind of have gotten pushback in the past from different professors saying, if I make my classes virtual or have a virtual option, what if no one comes? And I kind of want to listen to you guys, the audience, and see what kind of counter responses can you come up with for that. What would you say to a professor who says, I don't want to make my class virtual because people won't come? Are there any ideas? It's a difficult question.
I think the problem might be that technology isn't as good. Doing things virtually is not always as good an experience as doing it in person. But if we can improve technology which I believe we can, and we invest in that ability, then discussions can happen. And we can communicate more effectively. We all learned that during COVID when nobody was teaching virtually, really, and we came this far. So to say we can't push it and invest more in technology to enable everybody to feel like they're part of the experience, I think that eliminates that argument. Is it as good?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that when we're considering issues of accessibility, professors don't always realize the magnitude of which this affects students. It's about 20% of your student population that identify as disabled. That's 1 in 5 students, which is a significant portion of the class. So if you're worried about people showing up, worry about that 20%, because that 20% exists too, and it's a significant percent. The next kind of thing that I wanted to talk about is offering lecture material in multiple formats. So a lot of, on the past slide, we were talking about more physical ways to make things more accessible, but there's also exists students with cognitive disabilities where maybe they process information better in a visual way, or better in a textual way, like reading, or better in a symbolic way. So or an auditory way. So it's always best practice to offer your lecture material in multiple formats. So providing a textbook that is free, number one, to all, because there, of course, exists other barriers to accessibility besides disability. There's monetary inaccessibility. So we have to be careful that when we are making things accessible for the disability community, that they're also accessible in other ways. So always offering a textbook that'll cover kind of the reading way of accessibility. Always having a lecture format instead of just a textbook, so physically lecturing, and that'll cover your auditory way of accessibility. And then your visual way is having slides, diagrams, pictures. All of these are helpful in communicating information because not everyone learns the same way. And this goes again to my point, which is this not only helps the disabled community, someone who has a learning disability, it'll help them to have it in different formats, but it also helps everyone else who also has different strengths in learning and processing. So it doesn't just help the disabled community, it helps 100% of the people in the room. And one easy way to do that is to provide slides in advance of the lecture so that students who struggle with taking notes in real time can have the notes in front of them and then scribble extra notes on top of that. Some more minute notes include avoiding chalkboards in classrooms because they tend to make noises that are not friendly for the autistic community. And whiteboards can be an easy replacement that are more sensory friendly. Built-in lab makeup dates, just like we talked about on the last slide, having a built-in time where folks can make up labs if they missed them, or make up assignments if they missed them. Here's a big one that we'll be talking about a little bit later, which is reducing high stakes exams. So what is a high stake exam? It's one where the majority of your grade or the majority of your score is relying on one exam instead of multiple. So the SAT is a really good example of a high stakes exam. It's one really long, big exam that can determine your entrance into college sometimes. A final exam that is the only exam in the class, that's a high stakes exam. Only having 2 exams, like a midterm and a final, those are both high stakes exams because they're making up a huge portion of your grade. So eliminating those would be making things more accessible. And finally, making a verbal and written disability accessibility statement on the first day of class. So it's great to have it on your syllabus, but what I find is when professors include it on their syllabus, they don't actually say anything. They say, we're going to review our syllabus, and they review everything except the accessibility policy. They'll have it written in there and they'll skip right over that because they're like, oh, well, everyone knows this. And it's not that important anyways. And that's what's communicated towards me. So not skipping over that on the first day of class. If you're going to go over your syllabus, you should definitely go over your policy towards accepting students with accommodations. So the next part of this will be kind of taking a deeper look at a specific class and a specific syllabus, and we'll be reviewing it as a group. But in order to kind of preface this, we have to go back to some very foundational ideas, which is, what is the point of a class and what is the point of an exam? There's a million different correct answers for this. There's probably very few wrong answers. But I'd like to hear from you guys about what your perspectives are on what is the point of a class or an exam.
For me, the point of a class is to learn a new set of information. And an exam is to indicate how well that students have been learning the information, or as a key to the professor on how well things are going and how well the students are learning the material.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And there's also a bunch of different, there's kind of, I think your first answer, which is what is the point of a class? And you said like to learn information. And I think I got another person in the chat says an all-inclusive environment to learn and grow together. And an exam is just a way to check in, to check if we are all on the same page. And these are great answers. And I think it differs for everyone. I think for me, the point of a class for me, I think of it in more of a career focused way, where I want a class to prepare me to have the skills so that I can become a researcher one day. To have the skills, to have the knowledge. And the point of the exam for me is to give information to a professor and to myself. I want the professor to know from the exam how much I've learned, and I want the exam to tell me how much I've learned as well. Just so you know, someone's not muted, just so you know. Thank you. So we're next going to take a look at a syllabus, which is a real syllabus from the University of Rochester. And it's a class called Chemistry 132, which kind of goes over concepts like quantum a little bit, like the basics, like Gibbs free energy, atomic orbitals. It's pretty standard basic chemistry knowledge for a first year class in chemistry. Let's see. Okay, can everyone see the syllabus that I've shared? Awesome. So the first thing that I want to note here is they start off with a course objectives. And that's great because we just defined what we wanted a course to teach us. The professor is defining what his or her objectives are, or their objectives are with the class. So that's always good. Now, right on the first page, they have a Chemistry 132 inclusion statement that pertains to students with disabilities as well as other accessibility difficulties. And they provide specific resources for students in this class. And what this tells me is, since it's on the first page, that tells me that the professor very clearly believes in these values and it's important to them. What I find usually in syllabi is that it's on the last page because they kind of copy and paste the accessibility statement from the Office of Disability Resources and they just throw it in there. But this syllabus really stuck out to me because it has an inclusion statement on the first page, which as a disabled student, that makes me feel really great because they're specifically looking at students like me. So let's take a little bit of a look at this class more specifically. So it says that lectures will be offered asynchronously. I guess I want to ask you guys, what do you think about this in terms of accessibility? How do you think that this might affect the disabled community as well as the rest of the students in the class? And there's pros and cons to it, so.
Yeah, I was going to say, I can see reasons why that's a good thing and a bad thing. I think for people who might not be able to go to class every single day at the time that class is, it's really beneficial to have access to lectures whenever is convenient for the student. But at the same time, I know some people have difficulty when there isn't a set time to do something, actually allocating that time to doing that task. And sometimes, you know, like lectures can build up, and then when you're coming up to a test, you have all of the lectures for the entire unit left. So I think, I mean, at least to me, I feel like in an ideal world, it might be nice to have synchronous lectures and then just have recordings available afterwards so that you can cater to both kinds of students.
Yeah, that's exactly what I would have said, which is asynchronous classes. Yeah, +1 at Valerie. Go Valerie. Completely agree. It can be beneficial, as Valerie said, for students with disabilities to have flexibility. But at the same time, it can also put a lot of responsibility on the student in terms of executive functioning, which can be significantly impacted for lots of students with disabilities. So it's kind of a note on that. We're going to scroll down here. I love that the professors have their pronouns in the syllabus. That's great. The textbook. It's great that they're including a textbook because, as we talked about before, having multiple different ways to learn and access information is really important. And I also love that it's available online for free at the following website, which makes it accessible for students who might struggle to purchase an expensive textbook, which is most people, I would say. So recorded lectures, as we described before, would be posted on Blackboard, which is just a website. They have a lecture schedule, which is really helpful. And here's the cool part that I really liked is that weekly summaries of major points and the lecture slides will be posted on that website, which is great because, again, for students who might struggle to absorb information in a lecture format, they'll have another format to reference things and take notes from and build off of. And other students actually, I just thought of this, some other students struggle to differentiate details from main points. So by having a list of major points from the professor, it can really help students who struggle to differentiate between what's the difference between a major point and a minor point. They also offered office hours during class time and as well as individual meetings, which is great because a lot of people might not be able to make the typical lecture time. And workshops. I'm not really sure how universal workshops are across the globe. Here at University of Rochester, workshops are very, very popular for classes where students will kind of come together and complete problems together, questions, etc. And that I find can be, again, another way to learn. So it'll increase accessibility by providing information in multiple formats, which is great. Here they provide a timeline and they actually divided it up into different modules, which will become key in a few minutes. They actually have 7 different modules, or really 6 different modules because 7 is a review. But they divided up the class into all of these different about 2-week modules on different topics. And that'll again help students who might have processing issues and might have organizational issues and difficulties to divide up material and make it more organized in their head, which is great. Grading. Now here's a really interesting one, which is why I picked this class. So this class is really interesting in that they used a point system that is meant to increase accessibility. Overall, in order to earn an A in the class, you had to get over 1,000 points. And then down from there, you can earn an A minus, B plus, etc. by earning different amounts of points. And in order to earn those points, you can do a whole host of different things. You can take a laboratory, which is required. You can take quizzes, which are not required. You can do homework. You can attend workshop and get points for that. You can complete a project. You can post on a website called Yellow Dig. You can create infographics, or you can profile a chemist, or you can make your own assignment. Basically, you could do whatever you wanted in order to earn points, and the professor and the TAs would grade it, and depending on how much points you earn determines your grade in the class. So I'm going to stop sharing right now, and I want to have like a somewhat thorough discussion of this. First, I want to hear your first reactions to how do we feel about this?
The point system specifically, or just the syllabus as a whole?
Yeah, the point system specifically.
Okay. I like the idea of the point system in terms of allowing students to pick and choose what works best for them and do the assignments. Like, I know some people are more artistically inclined as opposed to writing a paper. I love that they could get a choice to do one of the things. However, speaking from personal experience, I'm also university. Some of the students, despite having all of these options, were not concretely learning the material. And so as a workshop leader the next semester, I was seeing a lot of students come in who didn't understand the concepts presented to them in specifically Chem 132 and some of the other courses that I know adopted this system. I'm not really sure what about it they weren't able to learn, but I know sometimes when things are purely online, it never sticks in my head personally. So I do love the idea of it, but I'm not sure how to get the execution to the point where students we know they're actually learning and then retaining that information.
Yeah, any other perspectives? I 100% agree with that, but I'm going to reserve my opinions until other people have spoken.
So, okay, I'm also a University of Rochester student, and I TA'd that course like the year that syllabus was like, that you drew it from, and also a course the following year that used a lot of the concepts students learned in the Chem 132 course. And I fully agree with everything Carly said, that in theory, this is really great and it's meant to be super inclusive, but in execution, it just did not like inspire proper learning and proper understanding of the concepts. I think the main reason why it didn't do that is because of the specific point breakdown. And there were sort of things that were worth a lot of points that didn't really involve the actual course material. Like the profile of scientist, for example, is super great and super interesting, but at the same time, it didn't really challenge the students to think about the course material. It was something that they could do by reading a biography. Simply just messing with the math of the point breakdown to make things like the homework or the exams or the infographics that are more directly involved with demonstrating their understanding of the material could yield better results.
Yeah, I'll jump in here and say that I agree. And while I wasn't a TA for the course and didn't take that course while that syllabus and that grading scheme was a thing, I would say that I have similar concerns, which is how is the rigor of the course being impacted? And when we talk about the rigor of a course, we have to be very specific, because sometimes we conflate two ideas. And the two ideas are rigor, which is how difficult the class is and how much the students are learning. And then there's this also other idea, which is kind of, I want to say, I like using the term academic hazing, which is to say that professors might feel that, well, if it was this hard for me, or I had to do it this way, you have to do it this way too. And sometimes we conflate those two ideas, which is that that making a course hard for the sake of making it hard because it was hard for them, it should be the same as you. And those are two completely different ideas. I want to emphasize that that what I'm talking about is not the other one, which is academic hazing. What I'm talking about is the rigor of the course. And there's a reason why courses should be the appropriate level of difficulty, because we want students to learn. We don't want to make it hard for the reason of being hard, right? We want to make it hard for the right reasons and not the wrong reasons. So it's really important to go back to those philosophical questions, which are, what is the point of a class and what is the point of an exam? And if the point of an exam is to assess your learning and how much the student has learned and how much you as the student have learned, then your test should reflect that. So ultimately, my opinion is that exams aren't bad. And that might be a shocker coming from a disability justice activist. Exams aren't always bad. They can push students to have to learn material. However, maybe we alter the ways that we administer examinations. For example, we can make them open note, which means that students have full access to materials, like notes that they took in class. And I guess I want to hear from you guys. What do you think about open note exams?
I feel like open note exams are like a really great resource because like being able to have them a lot of the times, especially in college, like the questions that you're being given are conceptual and are not things that you write down when you're studying unless you're going off of a practice problem. And so being able to just have that like basic information, you're like, oh crap, I forgot like what this like specific thing is that I desperately need to answer this like conceptual question. That can be really useful. And I've taken classes like I took an engineering class where it was open note, and you know, not many people did very great on the exam. And sometimes like it really does just depend on what the questions are. But I think open note is really good in general. And it's a good way to be able to support students while still like challenging them.
Yeah, I completely agree. Go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, I was just agreeing. I have a specific course that I took last year that the exams were open note and like open internet, and sometimes you had to actually go on the internet, like find a paper or like even find, like I think we had to go find a specific like gene or something to use to answer the question. So better preparation for the things that you'd be doing in your career, because in real life you're going to have the internet, you're going to have all your resources available to you, and you don't need to memorize quite as much as it would seem for an exam.
Exactly. I 100% agree. And that's exactly what I was going to say, which is as someone who wants to become a professional scientist, that Google is going to be there for me forever. And tangent. And I think that that's important to consider. What are your career goals, and why are we, again, go back to those philosophical questions. What is the purpose of a class and what is the purpose of an exam? So I'm going to share my screen again and we'll move off of exam topics. But I do want, here's my slide, which is think radically. When we're thinking about accessibility, it doesn't have to be the same old, same old. There's new ways to go about accessibility. And like another participant had mentioned earlier, the COVID-19 pandemic has certainly affected how we think about accessibility. It's kind of, I think that for years and decades, disability justice activists have been begging for virtual options, and virtual options only came in the form of a pandemic, which tells us, number one, how much do we value the disability community when it only came when it affected everyone. So I guess think about that and think radically. There are ways to make things accessible, and it might not be your first thought. So finally, we've reached the third part of the webinar, which is accessibility in the lab. And by in the lab, I'm specifically referring to not a classroom lab, but more of a professional research lab. So I wanted to start with the obvious, which is kind of thinking about folks with more mobility concerns, such as tube openers. Tube openers are some simple tools that you can incorporate into your lab that are pretty cheap. Sometimes those Eppendorf tubes or those like small microcentrifuge tubes can be difficult for those who have fine motor impairments. So by getting a tube opener, it can open up a world of opportunities besides just the tube. Sorry, I had to do that. Also ergonomic pipettes. These are just pipettes that can be more easily used by folks with different joint issues or muscle tone issues, etc., who might experience fatigue faster than others. So if you're pipetting for hours a day and using a typical pipette, that might become difficult for someone who's disabled. Whereas if you purchase a set of ergonomic pipettes, it might be easier for them to continue on for longer amounts of time. Not only do these benefit the disabled community, they also, of course, I'm going to bring this back for the 10th time, they also benefit the non-disabled community, because pipetting for hours at a time can sometimes lead to damage to your hand, but also it can get a little bit tiring. So having ergonomic pipettes can benefit everyone. Chairs, I know they seem really simple, but having chairs, a lot of labs don't have them. So incorporating those into your lab can make it a world more accessible. Floor mats. Floor mats can be great for joint stabilization. If you're standing for long periods of time and you don't choose to use a chair, it can significantly improve your experience of standing. Sensory-friendly goggles. I think that every single time I went into a chem lab, everyone groaned about having to put on goggles, and yeah, it can be not very fun because they fog up, or for folks with glasses, it can be a little bit difficult to get them to fit over. But I think the main thing was sensory wise, it didn't feel great on your face. And I would imagine that for autistic folks, I don't personally struggle with this sensory issue, but for other autistic folks, I know that they struggle putting things on their face and feeling that sensation on their face. So by getting a pair of sensory friendly goggles, that can help to ameliorate that problem. And finally, label makers, that can be really great for those with fine motor difficulties who struggle with writing things on very small labels. So again, a fairly cheap solution. So these aren't always economically accessible, but they are more obvious solutions that you can incorporate pretty readily into your lab. These are also pretty specific to some disabilities. They'll help the non-disabled community, but they're more specific towards mobility disabilities of those types. Here are some things that you might not have thought about. For example, if you're having a long lab meeting, which means like about 1.5 hours, you should typically schedule a break. And again, this benefits folks with disabilities, but it also benefits everyone else who might not have the attention span to focus for more than 1.5 hours. So if you're thinking of hosting any meetings that are more than 1.5 hours long, consider incorporating a break. If you're having a lab meeting, visually describe graphs. So there might be folks who have low vision, that's true. So visually describing a graph can be important, but it's also important for folks who don't always process graphs very easily, which can be a lot of the population. It takes us all like kind of a minute to get oriented to what is the x-axis, what is the y-axis. So I find that a lot of times during my lab meetings, people throw graphs up on the board and they say, look, it shows a correlation and this is what we know from it, but they don't always tell us what they're actually measuring. So I think not only does it make it more accessible to those who might have difficulty processing the graph, it can also make it so that you're a better scientist and that you get more specific questions and that people are actually checking your work. Provide background information so that if someone has a difficult time remembering, like I do, I struggle with remembering the past presentation. So if you provide a little bit of background information as to what you're doing and why, it can increase accessibility tenfold for me. And I all of a sudden will have a lot more constructive feedback to give you. And finally, use visuals, which we've talked about a lot during this presentation. Having a lab office for breaks. Of course, everyone should have a lab office, which is somewhere besides the laboratory that is not like a sterile environment and doesn't have chemicals all over it. But it's particularly important for those with disabilities because they might need to decompress and sit down. And I know that as an autistic person, it can be difficult for me to be overstimulated in a really stimulating lab environment, and to have somewhere to go take a break, kind of settle down in a lab office can be really crucial for me. Maintaining reasonable expectations and define what those expectations are. A lot of folks can struggle with knowing what they're supposed to be doing or how to manage their time or what the PI's expectations are. So by clearly designating what those are, it can make someone who's disabled feel a lot better about, okay, this is what I'm supposed to be completing, and this is what I will complete. And finally, lab outing accessibility. We always love lab outings, but it's always best practice to ask your students in the lab, is this accessible to you? So I have some guidelines that are more specific for professors and then for peers. So if you're a professor and you're sitting in on this conversation, these will apply to you. And then I also have the next slide, which is specifically for undergraduate students. So if you are an undergraduate student or maybe a grad student and you have a peer who you want to help and be more accessible towards, I have recommendations just based off of personal experience. So first, how to be a good professor to disabled students. Make clear that accessibility is a priority for you. So ideally, you can introduce that in the first conversation. Say that, so if you're a professor in a classroom, again, stating the syllabus very, very clearly and saying, hey, accessibility is very important to me. If you have any accommodations and want to discuss this further, please talk to me. If you're a PI and you're accepting a new student, what this can look like is, without having the student even disclose their disability, you can say, just so you know, I want to be as accommodating as possible, and accessibility is a really key concern for me. So if anything ever comes up, whether that be monetarily, whether that be time-wise, whether that be disability-wise, I want to make my lab environment as accessible as possible. So please let me know if that's something that would pertain to you, and we can work something out. So that's what a conversation can kind of look like. The second point is be aware of the services that your university offers. I think that as a PI, you should be responsible for knowing that. If a student comes up to you and says, hey, I've been struggling with XYZ, it would be great if you could refer them to those resources and say, hey, we have a Office of Disability Resources, or hey, here's the CARE Network, which is something specific to University of Rochester. So if you can refer students, that's a great point of access. And you should also know the limitations of those services, so that you're aware of the fact that they're not going to fix everything, and that you yourself as a PI are going to have to kind of take your own stand in there and make sure that it is actually accessible. Be comfortable talking about disability topics. How would you respond if a student started discussing disability? I've had this happen like really recently to me, where I've been talking to a professor about my disability and they kind of nodded and then changed the subject, which to me that either means one, they don't care about me, which I don't think is true, or two, they were uncomfortable with it. So I'm guessing it's the second one, and that they were uncomfortable about it. And that made me feel bad because it made me feel like I had said something wrong, or that my existence as a disabled person is somehow wrong, and that I should try harder to not be disabled. So that's what that communicates. And so it's really important that you be comfortable talking about disability topics, and even if you need to, practice talking about disability topics. Another key point is during just general meetings like lab meetings or conversations with your students, it's okay to bring up topics of general mental health, such as imposter syndrome or stress about work. That kind of normalizes something that everyone experiences, because everyone has general mental health. And, you know, there are some folks who are more strongly impacted by negative mental health than others, but everyone shares mental health together. So talking about those general topics such as imposter syndrome and stress during work that are a little bit less personal can be really helpful in opening up the lab discussion about making it a more comfortable topic. Here's my favorite tip, which is don't make science your sole identity. Make it clear that scientists can have a life and identity outside of science, and that's okay. And it's more than okay. And I think this applies to more than just the disabled community. So the way I've experienced this is when I go to my research lab, I have always historically felt that I have to become not disabled, or I have to try to be as able-bodied as possible, because there is no space in science for disability. But I think this applies to a lot of other things, for example, this month is Pride Month, so let's talk about that. The LGBTQ plus community exists in science, and I think that a lot of STEM tends to communicate that your identity beyond science isn't important. And what that might feel like for someone who might be bisexual and have a wife or something like that, it might feel like, well, I have to hide that because my identity beyond science is not important in the workplace. And that results in kind of squashing your other identities and going to work and becoming a scientist and leaving that behind and going home and then being a completely different person. And for me, I've experienced that in the realm of disability, where I can come home and be disabled, but as soon as I go to work, I can't be anymore. And I have to be as able-bodied as possible, and I have to push my limits, and I have to attempt to do things 100% normally, if you will. So that's kind of my biggest tip, is don't make science your sole identity. Communicate that you have a wife and kids. Communicate that you have hobbies. You have a life beyond science, and that's okay for your students to know. Be explicit. Don't jump around uncomfortable topics. And then finally, generate individual expectations with each student in a collaborative manner. So define what your expectations are. And if it's a student with disabilities and you know that maybe the same expectations won't work and you have to alter your expectations and say, you know what, they might not be able to work for 8 hours a day. Maybe they spread out that time over 6 days instead of 5, or generating those expectations individually can be really important. And finally, how to be a good peer to disabled folks. So if you're an undergrad here and you're in iGEM and you want to be more accessible to disabled folks, these are some key tips. Number 1, include disability in topics of marginalized identities in STEM. A lot of times we talk about marginalized identities in STEM because STEM is incredibly exclusionary and it tends to exclude marginalized identities. So when we're talking about these things, we have to make sure that we're talking about the disability community as well, because a lot of the time they tend to be forgotten in these conversations. If a peer discloses a disability, ask them what they need and what help you can provide. Don't be afraid to discuss disability when it comes up in conversations. So again, just like I said for the professor slide, don't change the topic out of uncomfortability. Ask them about it. Ask them, I would avoid asking them about their specific disability and asking them, oh, well, how, what does that mean for you? And asking them a million questions about their disability. I've been on the receiving end of that and it doesn't feel great. What does feel great is general questions saying, hey, how can I help you? Can you tell me more about that if you feel comfortable? Don't interrogate them about it, but do ask. It makes me feel like you care. Educate yourself, listen. So a really simple way to do that is to try following hashtags on Twitter. A lot of us are on social media. So if you follow a hashtag such as #DisabledInSTEM, a lot of posts will come up on your feed talking about issues related to disability so that you can remain informed about the community. Advocate for accessibility issues, even if it doesn't affect you personally. And here's a crucial one. You might think that as an undergraduate, you don't have a lot of power in influencing how accessible STEM is, but that's not necessarily true. You can think about the roles in which you do have power, which is, are you a TA? Are you a workshop leader? Are you a tutor? Even those small jobs where you might not be a full professor can make a huge difference in terms of accessibility. I know that my TAs have been incredibly helpful in making content more accessible for me, and don't overlook that. Do research and apply the same concepts that I told you to apply as a professor and apply them to your workshops. And finally, don't make science your only identity. Again, that's really important. Even as an undergrad, make sure that that works. So finally, here, if you could scan the QR code, it would be really helpful for me if you could fill it out. It's just going to ask you, it's like a 2 to 3 minute question that asks you, what exactly have you learned? What concepts are you going to be applying to your real life? And how are you going to make things more accessible? So with that, thank you very much. And that's a wrap. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.